We are getting toward the end of the borrowers. When we last left off, the boy had a plan to kind of take them back to the Badger set, and then they could live there and he would take stuff with them. But Mrs. Driver showed up. So the boy had to, well, he was taken up to bed, and the borrowers kind of disappeared. And so we don't know what's going to happen, but we have to remember this story is being told by Mrs. May to Kate. Remember that way back at the beginning of the story? And this is Mrs. May's brother. He says all this happened to him. And now we're going to go back to Mrs. May and Kate. "And that," said Mrs. May, laying down her crochet hook, "is really the end." Kate stared at her. "Oh, it can't be," she gasped. "Oh, please, please." "The last square," said Mrs. May, smoothing it out on her knee. "The 150th. Now we can sew them together." "Oh," said Kate, breathing again. "The quilt. Why, I thought you meant the story." "Oh, it's the end of the story, too," said Mrs. May absently. "Or the beginning. He never saw them again." And she began to sort out the squares. "But," stammered Kate, "you can't, it's not fair," she cried. "It's cheating. It's—" Tears sprang to her eyes. She threw her work down on the table and her crochet hook after it, and she kicked the bag of wools which lay beside her on the carpet. "Why, Kate? Why?" Mrs. May looked genuinely surprised. "Something more must have happened," cried Kate angrily. "What about the rat catcher? Oh, and the policeman, and the—" "Oh, but something more did happen," said Mrs. May. "A lot more happened. I'm going to tell you." "Well, then why did you say it was the end?" "Because," said Mrs. May, she still looked surprised, "he never saw them again." "Well, then how can there be more?" "Because," said Mrs. May, "there is more, a lot more." Kate glared at her. "All right," she said. "Go on." Mrs. May looked back at her. "Kate," she said after a moment, "stories never really end. They can go on and on and on. It's just that sometimes, at a certain point, one stops telling them." "Oh, but not at this kind of point," said Kate. "Well, thread your needle," said Mrs. May, "with gray wool this time, and we'll sew these squares together. I'll start at the top, and you can start at the bottom. First a gray square, then an emerald, then a pink, and so on." "Then you didn't really mean it," said Kate irritably, trying to push the folded wool through the narrow eye of the needle. "When you said you never saw them again. When you said he never saw them again." "Oh, but I did mean it," said Mrs. May. "I'm telling you just what happened. He had to leave, suddenly, at the end of the week, because there was a boat for India and a family who could take him. And for 3 days before he left, they kept him locked up in those 2 rooms. "For 3 days!" exclaimed Kate. Yes, Mrs. Driver, it seemed, told Aunt Sophie that he had a cold. She was determined, you see, to keep him out of the way until she'd got rid of the borrowers." "And did she?" asked Kate. Did they all come? The policeman, and the rat catcher, and the sanitary inspector didn't come, at least not while my brother was there. And they didn't have the rat catcher from the town hall, but they had the local man. The police came." Mrs. May laughed. "During those 3 days, Mrs. Driver used to give my brother a running commentary on what was going on below. She loved to grumble, and my brother, rendered harmless and shut away upstairs, became a kind of neutral. She used to bring his meals up, and on that first morning she brought all the doll's furniture up on the breakfast tray, and made my brother climb the shelves and put it back in the doll's house. It was then she told him about the policeman. Furious, he said she was." "Why?" asked Kate. "Because the policeman turned out to be Nellie Runacre's son, Ernie, a boy Mrs. Driver had chased many a time for stealing russet apples from the tree by the gate. 'A nasty, thieving, good-for-nothing dribbit of a no-good,' she told my brother. Sitting down there he is now in his kitchen, large as life, with his notebook out, laughing, fit to bust. 21, he says he is now, and as cheeky as you make 'em." "And was he?" asked Kate, round-eyed. "A dribbit of a no-good?" "Well, of course not, any more than my brother was. Ernie Runacre was a fine, upstanding young man and a credit to the police force, and he did not actually laugh at Mrs. Driver when she told him her story, but he gave her what Crampfurl spoke of afterward as an old-fashioned look, when she described a homily in bed. 'Take more water with it,' it seemed to say." So he thought that maybe she had too much to drink. "More water with what?" asked Kate. "The fine old pale Madeira, I suppose," said Mrs. May. And Great-Aunt Sophie, had the same suspicion. She was furious when she heard that Mrs. Driver had seen several little people, when she herself, on a full decanter, had only risen to one, or at most two. Crampfurl had to bring all the Madeira up from the cellar and stack the cases against the wall in a corner of Aunt Sophie's bedroom, where, as she said, she could keep an eye on it. "Did they get a cat?" asked Kate. "Yes, they did, but that wasn't much of a success either. It was Crampfurl's cat, a large yellow Tom with white streaks in it. According to Mrs. Driver, it had only two ideas in its head: to get out of the house or into the larder. Talk of borrowers," Mrs. Driver would say as she slammed down the fish pie for my brother's luncheon. That cat's a borrower if ever there was one. Borrowed the fish, that cat did, and a good half-bowl of egg sauce. But the cat wasn't there long. The first thing the rat-catcher's terriers did was to chase it out of the house. There was a dreadful set to, my brother said. They chased it everywhere, upstairs and downstairs, in and out of all the rooms, barking their heads off. The last glimpse my brother had of the cat was streaking away through the spinney and across the fields with the terriers after it." "Did they catch it?" "No," Mrs. May laughed. "It was still there when I went a year later. A little morose, but as fit as a fiddle." "Tell me about when you went." "Oh, I wasn't there long," said Mrs. May rather hastily. "And after that the house was sold. My brother never went back." Kate stared at her suspiciously, pressing her needle against the center of her lower lip. "So they never caught the little people?" she said at last. Mrs. May's eyes flicked away. "No, they never actually caught them. But," she hesitated, "as far as my poor brother was concerned, what they did do seemed even worse." "What did they do?" Mrs. May laid down her work and stared for a moment thoughtfully at her idle hands. "I hated the rat-catcher," she said suddenly. "Why? Or did you know him?" "Oh, everybody knew him. He had a walleye, and his name was Rich William. He was also the pig-killer. And, well, he did other things as well. He had a gun, a hatchet, a spade, a pickaxe, and a contraption with bellows for smoking things out. I don't know what the smoke was exactly. Poison fumes of some kind which he made himself from herbs and chemicals. I only remember the smell of it. It clung around the barns or wherever he'd been. You can imagine what my brother felt on that third day, the day he was leaving, when suddenly he smelled that smell. He was all dressed and ready to go. The bags were packed and down in the hall. Mrs. Driver came and unlocked the door and took him down the passage into Aunt Sophie. He stood there, stiff and pale, in gloves and overcoat, beside the curtained bed. "Seasick already?" Aunt Sophie mocked him, peering down at him over the edge of the great mattress. "No," he said, "it's that smell." Aunt Sophie lifted her nose. She sniffed. "What smell is it, Driver?" "It's the rat-catcher, my lady," explained Mrs. Driver, reddening, "down in the kitchen." "What?" exclaimed Aunt Sophie. "Are you smoking them out?" And she began to laugh. Oh, dear, she gasped. "But if you don't like them, Driver, the remedy's simple." "What is that, my lady?" asked Mrs. Driver coldly, but even her chins were red. Helpless with mirth, Aunt Sophie waved a ringed hand towards her. Her eyes were screwed up and her shoulders shaking. "Keep the bottle corked," she managed at last, and motioned them weakly away. They heard her laughing still as they went on down the stairs. So she says if she doesn't drink the Madeira, she won't see the little people anymore. You don't need to smoke them out. She She don't believe in them," muttered Mrs. Driver, and she tightened her grip on my brother's arm. "More fool her, she'll change her tune like enough when I take them up afterward, laid out in sizes on a clean piece of newspaper." And she dragged him roughly across the hall. The clock had been moved, exposing the wainscot, and as my brother saw at once, the hole had been blocked and sealed. The front door was open as usual, and the sunshine streamed in. The bag stood there beside the fiber mat, cooking a little in the golden warmth. The fruit trees beyond the bank had shed their petals and were lit with tender green, transparent in the sunlight. "Plenty of time," said Mrs. Driver, glancing up at the clock. "The cab's not due till 3:30. "The clock stopped," said my brother. Mrs. Driver turned. She was wearing her hat and her best black coat, ready to take him to the station. She looked strange and tight and chapel-going, not a bit like Driver. "So it has," she said. Her jaw dropped, and her cheeks became heavy and pendulous. "It's moving it," she decided after a moment. "It'll be all right," she went on, "once we get it back. Mr. Firth comes on Monday." And she dragged again at his arm above the elbow. "Where are we going?" he asked, holding back along the kitchen. "We've got a good 10 minutes. Don't you want to see them caught?" "No," he said. "No," and pulled away from her. Mrs. Driver stared at him, smiling a little. "I do," she said. "I'd like to see 'em close. He puffs this stuff in and they come running out. At least that's how it works with rats. But first, he says, you block up all the exits." And her eyes followed his to the hole below the wainscot. "How did they find it?" the boy asked. Puttied it looked, and with a square of brown paper pasted on crooked. "Rich William found it. That's his job." "Well, they could unstick that," said the boy after a moment. Mrs. Driver laughed. "Oh, no, they couldn't. Cemented, that is, a great block of it right inside, with a sheet of iron across from the front of that old stove in the outhouse. He and Crampfurl had to have the morning room floor up to get at it. All Tuesday they was working up till me tea time. We aren't going to have any more capers of that kind, not under the clock. Once you get that clock back, it can't be moved again in a hurry. Not if you want to keep time, it can't. So where it stood, where the floor's washed away like, it was then my brother saw for the first time and last that raised platform of unscrubbed stone. "Come on now," said Mrs. Driver, and took him by the arm. "We'll hear the cab from the kitchen." And this is kind of hard to do because it's Mrs. May speaking, but she's also talking about what the other character said. So I'm just staying as Mrs. May talking to Kate. So when I remember. But the kitchen, as she dragged him past the baize door, seemed a babel of sound. No approaching cab could be heard here, what with yelps and barks and stampings and excited voices. "Steady, steady, steady," Crampfurl was saying on one loud note as he held back the rat-catcher's terriers, which shrilled and panted on the leash. The policeman was there, Nellie Runacre's son Ernie. He had come out of interest and stood back from the others a little, in view of his calling, with a cup of tea in his hand and his helmet pushed off his forehead. But his face was pink with boyish excitement, and he stirred the teaspoon round and round. "Seeing's believing," he said cheerfully to Mrs. Driver when he saw her coming in at the door. A boy from the village was there with a ferret. It kept sort of pouring out of his pocket, my brother said, and the boy kept pushing it back. Rich William himself was crouched on the floor by the hole. He had lighted something beneath a piece of sacking, and the stench of it smoldering eddied about the room. He was working the bellows now with infinite care, stooping over them, wrapped and tense. My brother stood there as though in a dream. Hang on. "Perhaps it was a dream," he said to me later, much later, after we were all grown up. He gazed round the kitchen. He saw the sunlit fruit trees through the window and boughs of the cherry tree which stood upon the blanket. He saw the empty teacups on the table with spoons stuck in them, and one without a saucer. He saw, propped against the wall, close beside the baize door, the rat-catcher's belongings: a frayed coat, patched with leather, a bundle of rabbit snares, two sacks, a spade, a gun, and a pickaxe. "Stand by now," Rich William was saying. There was a rising note of excitement in his voice, but he did not turn his head. "Stand by. Ready now to slip the dogs." Mrs. Driver let go my brother's arm and moved toward the hole. "Oh, keep back," said the rat-catcher without turning. "Give us room." And Mrs. Driver backed nervously toward the table. She put a chair beside it and half raised one knee, but lowered it again when she caught Ernie Runacre's mocking glance. She was getting ready to step up on the chair if they came running out. "All right, Ma," he said, cocking one eyebrow. "We'll give you a leg up when the time comes." And Mrs. Driver threw him a furious look. She snatched up the 3 cups from the table and stomped away with them, angrily into the scullery. Seemingly much of something or other, my brother heard her mutter as she brushed past him, and at those words, suddenly, my brother came to life. He threw... Just a second. I think there's one more chapter. Okay, there is. He threw a quick glance about the kitchen. The men were absorbed. All eyes were on the rat-catcher, except those of the village boy who was getting out his ferret. Stealthily, my brother drew off his gloves and began to move backwards, slowly, slowly, toward the green baize door. As he moved, gently stuffing his gloves into his pocket, he kept his eyes on the group around the hole. He paused a moment beside the rat-catcher's tools and stretched out a wary, groping hand. His fingers closed at last on a wooden handle, smooth it was and worn with wear. He glanced down quickly to make sure. Yes, it was, as he hoped, the pickaxe. He leaned back a little and pushed, almost imperceptibly, against the door with his shoulders. It opened sweetly on its silent way. Not one of the men had looked up. "Steady now," the rat-catcher was saying, stooping closely over the bellows. "It takes a moment, like, to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor." My brother slid through the barely open door, and it sighed to behind him, closing out the noise. He took a few steps on tiptoe down the dark kitchen passage, then he ran. There was the hall again, steeped in sunshine, with his bags beside the door. He bumped against the clock, and it struck a note, a trembling note, urgent and deep. He raised the pickaxe to the height of his shoulder and aimed a sideways blow at the hole beside the wainscot. The paper tore, a few crumbles of plaster fell out, and the pickaxe rebounded sharply, jarring his hands. There was indeed iron behind the cement, something immovable. Again he struck, and again. The wainscot above the hole became a split and scratched, and paper hung down in strips. But still the pickaxe bounced. It was no good. His hands, wet with sweat, were sliding and slipping on the wood. He paused for breath, and looking out he saw the cab. He saw it on the road behind the hedge, on the far side of the orchard. Soon it would reach the russet apple tree beside the gate. Soon it would turn into the drive. He glanced up at the clock. It was ticking steadily, the result perhaps of his knock. The sound gave him comfort and steadied his thumping heart. "It takes a moment, like," the rat-catcher had said, "to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor." Ventilation. That was the word, the saving word. Pickaxe in hand, my brother ran out of the door. He stumbled once on the gravel path and nearly fell. The pickaxe handle came up and struck him a sharp blow on the temple. Already, when he reached it, a thin filament of smoke was eddying out of the grating, and he thought, as he ran towards it, that there was a flicker of movement against the darkness between the bars. And then that was where they would be, of course, to get the air. But he did not stop to make sure. Already he heard behind him the crunch of wheels on the gravel and the sound of horses' hooves. He was not, as I told you, a very strong little boy, and he was only 9, not 10 as he had boasted to Arrietty. But with 2 great blows on the brickwork, he dislodged one end of the grating. It fell down sideways, slightly on a slant, hanging, it seemed, by one nail. Then he clambered up the bank and threw the pickaxe with all his might into the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He remembered thinking, as he stumbled back, sweaty and breathless, toward the cab, how that, too, the loss of the pickaxe, would cause its own kind of trouble later. That's the end of that chapter. So he went to the grating and he broke that open in hopes that the borrowers would be able to get out that way. So we don't really know. We already know he never saw them again. So we'll see how it ends. I think there's one more chapter.